sponsored by the Institute of Museum and Library Services.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. My name is Naomi Kokione, and I'm the Chief of Informal Learning at the library. I'm here today interviewing Kekla Magoon, author of Revolution in Our Time, the Black Panther Party's Promise to the People. To our online audience, thank you for joining. We'll take your questions during this interview, so please add them to the Q&A feature on the page. Kekla, thanks so much for being here. Very excited to have you. To get us started, I'd love to talk with you about the festival's theme this year, which is Open a Book, Open the World. And I wonder if there were any books that you read growing up that opened the world to you or new worlds to you, and also what you hope your book will open up for your readers.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved reading as a kid, and it was the most exciting, most important thing that I did, I think, for myself as a young person in preparation for being a writer. And one of my favorite books, one of the books that definitely stands out in my memory from middle school, was Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry by Mildred D. Taylor. And that is a historical novel. It was one of the first novels I remember encountering that had a Black girl protagonist, and it illuminated some things about Black history that I hadn't really understood or hadn't really been taught. And it still stands out in my mind as a book. I see images from that book just when I mention the title or talk about it, and so it was a really powerful experience to me. It showed me myself in a book, the way that we talk about books being windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, as Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop wrote about it in an article some years ago. It was definitely a mirror book for me, but also a windows book because it opened up new ideas and new pieces of history to me. And when I became an author, my first novel, The Rock and the River, was a historical novel. And I remember thinking I would love for any reader to to have the same experience with The Rock and the River that I had with Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And I hoped that I could do that with my work. And my new novel, it's not a novel, it's a nonfiction book. My new nonfiction book, Revolution in Our Time, is also sort of in that same tradition. This is a nonfiction book about the Black Panther Party, which offers background on the party. It offers a lot of information about Black American history. And for me, this book has the potential to open people's minds to different sides of history, different perspectives on history, different aspects of history that don't normally get explored in the way that we've been teaching history for a long time. And so I think it's particularly exciting to get to talk about those things, and particularly exciting to get to share a different perspective on history of Black American history with a young audience.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And your recorded interview had a great exchange about women in the party, not the role of women, but the importance of them and your discovery of that. And we might have come back to that, but we have a question from Sienna who says, I'm a Girl Scout and was excited to read that you used to work with us. Did any of your experiences with the Scouts make it into your books?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, I was a Girl Scout as a child. So I was a Daisy Girl Scout, a Brownie Girl Scout, and I think briefly a Junior Girl Scout. I didn't make it all the way to senior, but as a college student, I worked at a Girl Scout camp for the summer. And when I moved to New York after I graduated from college, I worked at the Girl Scout Council of Greater New York, running Girl Scout programs around the city. And definitely the experience of working with the Girl Scouts has helped me as an author because that was the first, working at camp and then working for the Girl Scout Council were some of the first times that I had the opportunity to present in front of huge groups of kids, which is something that I do routinely now. And so that experience definitely prepared me for what it feels like to be up in front of an audience talking about anything but talking about my work, right? In terms of making it into the books, I think that the sense of empowerment and the sense of adventure that Girl Scouting can imbue in young people is something that I write about a lot. And that sense that you now today, no matter how young you think you are or how old you are, you can be somebody who makes a difference in the world. You can be somebody who figures out, well, what am I good at? What are my skills? How can I change the world in a way that is important to me? And so the idea that as a young person, you have that power, that's something I write about a lot. And I do think that that connects really strongly to my background with the Girl Scouts, both as a Girl Scout and working with the Girl Scouts. So shout out to all the fellow Girl Scouts out there.
All right. Well, and I'm curious too, if, in addition to making it into your books, if your work with Girl Scouts had any influence on your decision to write for middle grade or young adult audiences, or what makes you want to write for this age group?
Yeah, I suspect that it does, in a sort of chicken and egg kind of way, where
Yeah.
I gravitated toward youth work long before I knew I was going to be a writer. Back when I wanted to be a doctor, which I did for a while, I wanted to be a pediatrician, and when I wanted to be a camp counselor, I wanted to work at a youth camp, and when I moved to New York and I was doing nonprofit development work and grant writing, I gravitated toward fundraising for youth programs. And I think that it's always been important to me to write for young audiences, to work with young audiences. I mean, I have been regarded as young for the majority of my life, and even the majority of my career, even as I'm becoming middle-aged, right? I'm often looked at, oh, you're so young, to have written all these books. Oh, you're so young to have done X, Y, and Z. And I guess so, but I also, like I said before, I feel like there's so much power in young people, there's so much potential there that we often try to put on hold. We say, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I want to say, what do you want to be now? Right. And so that drive, that excitement about what we can do as young people is what keeps me writing for this age group, what keeps me wanting to interact with the kids and teens and help them see what the world sometimes wants them not to see, which is their own power and their own ability to do things in the moment.
Well, and so you talked about sort of gravitating to youth work. How did you come into writing and become a writer? And when did you sort of see yourself as a writer?
Well, if you ask my mother, she will tell you that I've been a writer since I was very small. I recently had a Facebook post from my third grade teacher, or my fourth grade teacher actually, who said, "Oh, I just remember, you writing in your journals so much, and loving to write in your journals." And I have no memory of any of that. I think of myself as coming to writing later. I mean, I definitely kept kind of a journal-ish thing under my pillow as a kid, and in middle school and high school. I wrote a novella at the end of my high school time just for fun, and I loved reading and I wanted to explore that. But at that time, I wouldn't have called myself a writer. I went to college, I was pre-med, it took me a little while to figure out that I wanted to do something different than that. And so by the time I graduated from college, I was kind of I don't know what I want to do, but I know I want to work with kids. And I want to go to New York. So I moved to New York and I lived in Manhattan. And while I was there, that was really when I got into writing and I think part of it stemmed from not knowing anybody in the city. It was a big city, and I was trying to make friends and meet people, and it takes time to do that. And, so I would go to work, I would come home, and I would write stories. And I think that it was comforting because stories have always been a comfort to me. I think that it was a way of kind of giving myself friends when I didn't have any, right? I could create some characters and put them on the page. And that was satisfying in a number of different ways. And I found that I was rushing home every day from work at the Girl Scouts and then other places I worked to write my stories and to tell my stories. And that, suddenly sort of made me realize, hey, you're spending a lot of time doing this thing. Maybe you should see what it is, like what it really is. Like maybe it's not a hobby. Maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's something that you're really passionate about. And so I started taking writing classes, and I got a master's degree in writing, and it just kind of all snowballed from there. But I think it came from a place of loneliness a lot of the time, in terms of writing fiction, like wanting to understand the world better, wanting to find my place in the world. And those are themes that I still write about, right? Identity and belonging and trying to make a difference in the world. Those are things that I want to do as a person, and things that I write about, and things that I let my characters explore in a lot of different ways, like no matter what genre or type of story I'm telling.
Well, and so can you speak to us about what your writing life looks like now? So it used to be you'd rush home and write, but now that you're a full-time writer, what does it look like? How do you do it? Where do you do it? How long each day? That sort of thing. Can you give us a window into that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, my process is pretty variable. It's kind of fluid in a lot of ways. Before the pandemic, I was doing a lot of travel and a lot of school visits and presentations and conferences. And so I would be writing anywhere I could, on a plane, in an airport, in a hotel, in a coffee shop, curled up in the corner on the convention center floor, at some massive conference. And writing at home. I have a big chair that I like to sit in. I have this is my dining room table, which has a quilt that my mother has made. This is where I do a lot of my professional events and a lot of my emails and things like that. But for creative stuff, I like to sit in my hammock sometimes. I like to sit on my porch sometimes. I like to go down to the coffee shop and write with my friends when I could do that safely and comfortably. So lately it's been, I've been writing in the mornings as much as I can, and then trying to do other things in the afternoon, work things like email, and then house things like taking care of, my yard and things like that, and trying to have some balance, because as somebody who does not have a 9-to-5 job anymore, right? I don't go to the office at 9 and come home at 5 like I used to. I have to find ways to put boundaries on the work, because it would be very easy for me to work almost 24 hours a day, right? Except for when I am sleeping. And so I try not to do that. I try to write in the morning and then do other kinds of work in the afternoon, and then be relaxed in the evening and watch TV or see my friends or anything like that I can do for fun, read books.
Great. Well, thank you for giving us that peek into your life. We've got some good questions coming in from the online audience, so I'll go to them now. So Billy asks, what do you like to read for fun? Anyone you're reading right now is either a break from the work reading or just as a guilty pleasure?
Yeah. So I currently have a specific list of 9 books that I'm reading, because Revolution in Our Time was named to a National Book Award long list title, and I had heard of but hadn't read most of the other books on the long list. So I rushed to the store to buy the ones I didn't already own and started reading the ones I already owned. So I'm reading those. At this moment, I'm reading Anna Marie McLemore's The Mirror Season. Right before that, I read Me Moth and by Amber McBride, and then I had already read Unspeakable by Carol Boston Weatherford, which is a picture book about the Tulsa Race Massacre, illustrated by Floyd Cooper. So those are some of the books that I've been diving into recently. And I'm super excited about that for a number of reasons, as you can imagine, but they're all really beautiful books and really different and amazing. And so I'm really enjoying that process. So that's what I've been up to.
Great. Well, and congratulations on that honor. It's really wonderful. Elizabeth asks, are the characters from Rock in the River and Fire in the Streets inspired by people you know in real life?
Generally, I don't base my characters on actual people that I know, but there's definitely some influence and inspiration that comes from people that I know. My brother, so I have one brother, and The Rock in the River and Fire in the Streets are both about relationships with a brother, right? So in The Rock in the River, it's the main character is Sam, who's a boy, and his brother is Stick. And then in Fire in the Streets, there's also a brother-sister relationship between Maxie and her brother Raheem. And so I think that the sibling dynamics are really, really different in those two relationships. But, like Stick has some qualities and characteristics that are kind of like my brother. He is tall and thin and very charismatic and energetic, and perhaps in some ways more certain about things than I am. And that's kind of how Stick is compared to Sam in that book. There are always little things that pop up. Like my dad sort of has the quality of, well, he's not a minister, but people sometimes think he is, because he kind of has this sort of aura to him. And so like Sam's dad is like that in The Rock in the River, but like my dad's not a lawyer and his dad is a lawyer, right? So like there's just little kind of shades that come in. I often will find, mother characters in my book saying things that my mother would say, and things like that, that are just, it's not that that character is anything like my mother. It's just that those are like kind of little brush strokes that get worked in to the novel. And the same thing with things that my friends have said or things that my friends have done in some cases. You just get ideas from the experiences and interactions that you have, and all of that informs the characters in really, really complicated ways. But there's no like sort of direct one-to-one correlation between somebody being deliberately based on anybody.
Well, as a follow-up to that, do you have a process for developing your characters? How do they come to life on the page for you? If you're pulling from different parts of your life or different inspiration?
Yeah, so I teach writing, and the hardest thing for me to teach is character because it's the thing that comes most naturally to me. I don't really have a process for teaching character. I don't have a process for creating them. They just sort of come and they are. And I find it really fascinating to hear other people talk about all the things that they sort of go through to design their characters. I mean, I have one friend who's like, well, I figure out their birthday and I look up their astrological sign, and like that's a whole like way of figuring out like somebody's personality. And I'm just like, what? I have no idea what any of my characters' birthdays are. Like, I don't know any of those kinds of really personal details, right? Some people sort of have like almost like a whole questionnaire they can fill out. What's your favorite color? What does their room look like? I love that as an exercise, though. If you're a writer, figuring out what your character's room looks like is a pretty great writing exercise, which I have done sometimes. Right, like figuring out the layout of the room and what kinds of things are on the wall gives you a kind of a glimpse into who a person is. So that's kind of a way that I kind of backdoor into character creation or character development. But for the most part, they feel very real to me. They feel like people that are kind of just hanging out in the back of my mind, and I kind of watch them doing things and think about how they would move through the world, and that's the aspect of writing that comes most naturally to me. I work much harder on things like plot and, line by line writing, like the way a sentence sounds, and, like transitions between scenes. I love writing in vignettes because, it can just be short chunks. And, a lot of times you have to make things, make sense and tie together in a novel. So those are things I struggle with more than character. Character comes pretty naturally to me, which I consider myself fortunate that is true.
We have another question from Sienna, who asks, how have libraries influenced your life?
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. How have libraries influenced my life? That is a huge question with a big answer. I would say that they've influenced everything about my life in a lot of different ways. I mean, I loved going to the library as a kid. My mom used to take us to the library every week. We would go at least on Wednesday, sometimes also on Sunday, just because it was like right next to our church where we used to go. And so like you could just go back and forth and stuff. And so we used to go right there to the library, and I would check out as many books as I could carry, from my hand to my chin. I would have a little stack of books coming out of the door. I don't know why I never put stuff in a bag. Like that would have been logical, but I just remember carrying like these huge stacks of paperbacks that I got off the racks and stuff. So definitely I read so much more in my life, as a young person, because I was able to go to the library regularly. As an adult, I feel like libraries continue to influence my life, partly because librarians are the people who are able to share my books with other readers, and they're really, really passionate about doing that. I have been fortunate to be recognized by a few American Library Association awards. And I feel like the librarians who do that kind of work within the organization around education and around advocacy, like they do so much to lift up my work and the work of other authors, and that has allowed me to have the type of career that I have. So I feel like librarians are very much the engine behind the success of many, many authors, such as myself. And then for writing something like Revolution in Our Time, this book was a massive research project. I worked on it for almost 10 years, collecting information about the Black Panthers and collecting information about the civil rights movement and traveling to different places that were important in the life of the Panthers, to study their history and to visit archives and all kinds of exciting things that I did. And through all of that, librarians were supporting me in that process. I went to the public library in Oakland, California. I went to the libraries all over the country. Honestly, the New York Public Library, because I lived in New York. I went to the Chicago Public Library, my local libraries here in Vermont, the Kellogg Hubbard Library right here in Montpelier, as well as the Vermont College of Fine Arts Library, which is where I teach. So librarians in all of these places have helped me do the research that I'm doing. And, it's something. I'm a very self-sufficient person. I'm somebody who sometimes is afraid to ask for help or to get somebody to support me. But the really cool thing about librarians is that they love helping people. That's their whole job, and they're so excited to do it. And so I would go up to the counter really nervously to be like, okay, I'm gonna need some help with this project. And I would invariably be greeted by an enthusiastic, oh, here's how I can help you with that. And here's more that you didn't even ask for, right? And it was this incredibly powerful. I found the research to be an incredibly powerful experience because I can't do things like that by myself. And it has really taught me that there are people out there who want to help, and love to advocate and share information and knowledge and resources and books. And so for me, libraries are just the lifeblood of so much of my existence.
Well, that's a really wonderful message to share. And I just want to say, that is also true of the Library of Congress. We have an Ask a Librarian service. I think people, especially, younger researchers might be afraid to ask, but please ask. That's why we're here to help. So, and actually it goes to one of the questions in the chat. Laura, go ahead.
I should have also mentioned the Library of Congress because I come there often, or did pre-pandemic. I've been there often, and I stay at a hotel right around the corner, and I come in with my library card and I check out all these huge amounts of photos. I have many photos from the Library of Congress that are in the book. So I love the Library of Congress. I especially love my little card that has my little researcher card that has my photo on it. It's I don't know why, it makes me feel very important.
I mean, it's understandable. And I will say for our audience that anyone 16 and up can come and register for one and use the main reading room. So we hope that you will at some point. And Laura B. In our chat had asked about your research process for Revolution in Our Time. So you've talked a bit about that. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to say about any sources that were especially illuminating for you, or valuable or important, or anything about the steps that might be helpful for our audience to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think the places I spent the most time were the Oakland Library and the Oakland Museum of California, which is also has an immense resource, but mostly the public library there in Oakland, and the Library of Congress, and then the New York Public Library, Schomburg Center. I did a lot of research there. Those are the places I physically spent the most time. And the thing I love about archives is that it's not just books that you can get, because books can be published and reprinted and moved around and all of these things, but they also have all of this ephemera and just kind of stuff. Ephemera is a fancy word for saying stuff that just relates to the party. So you go in and you put on these little white gloves, and they bring you folders of photos from the period. They bring you programs from of special events that happened, and flyers from special events that happened, and buttons, and all kinds of things that are just there. And so my favorite part of the research process, I think, was sort of just going through those boxes at the Oakland Museum or the Oakland Library, and feeling in some way, there's a tangible physical connection now between me and this history, because I've had the opportunity to touch, a funeral program, right, from somebody whose life story I've been telling, and, to touch, all of these, through the little white gloves, to touch all of these objects, and to actually read the a physical copy of the old Black Panther newspaper, and they're, sort of aging and brittling, and, so you have to be really careful when you're making photocopies and taking pictures and things like that. But I don't know, it sort of imbued me with a kind of reverence for the minutia of what this experience is. You think about, I'm telling a story about protest, I'm telling a story about revolution, but somebody made a lot of photocopies, right, in the office, and somebody, punched all these buttons out on the machine, and somebody, somebody was probably crying when they folded this free funeral program, right? Just all of these things that, especially as someone who also writes fiction, it it sort of feeds this the imagination side of me when I'm mostly sifting through facts and looking for the sort of narrative around the facts. And so I felt like that part of the process was really powerful. I truly went like a lot of, I mean, I looked at archives in Missouri. I looked at in St. Louis area. I looked at archives in Seattle. Pretty much anytime I went anywhere for a professional trip to a conference, I would look at their library and see if they had anything related to the Black Panther Party that was, you know, something I could look at. And so I did a lot of that and a lot of museums. I love the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture that opened 5 years ago, I think today, or 5 years ago this week. It was brand new. So I got to go there and look at their beautiful collections and exhibits, but also use their archives as a research resource. There was so much out there, and there wasn't when I started this project 10 years ago. It was really going to Oakland and digging through the archives, and more is becoming available online. More and more is becoming more understood and more accessible to readers of all kinds. And so that's been really exciting to watch that unfold and to see sort of how much more resources there are, how many more resources there are today than there were 10 years ago, or how less hidden they are now.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really, I mean, it's helpful for our audience to hear the scope of the work behind this this project, and you know, the breadth of resources you were drawing on over the 10 years that you took to research and write the book. Billy has another question. He says, besides the critical acclaim, have you gotten other reactions to Revolution in Our Time? The Black Panther Party hasn't always been considered a benevolent organization.
I haven't specifically, you know, in response to this book, because partly because it's just coming out, right? It's brand new. So, you know, there hasn't been a lot of time yet for people to criticize it. I'm sure that will happen, especially in the specific landscape we're in right now, where there is a sort of dynamic and in many ways troubling conversation about how we teach about Black history, how we teach about race and racism and bias in, you know, through literature specifically, but right in school in general. So I anticipate that will happen and that I will be part of those conversations. And I am prepared to do that because I've been doing it throughout my career on other books, with The Rock and the River and Fire in the Streets, which were also, again, about the Black Panther Party. When they came out, which is now, you know, 9-10 years ago, it for the most part, the criticism was more like people being like, well, that doesn't sound right. You know, wait, what do you mean the Black Panthers had a free breakfast program? That doesn't sound right. And so I'm going into this project, I went into this book with the idea, the vision of trying to help people understand a deeper truth, a broader understanding of the Black Panthers. You know, many people, you say Black Panthers, they think, oh, bad, scary, violent, right? Like that's the first impression. And I want to help people unpack that. I want people to help people see behind that. I want people to understand that the Black Panthers carried guns for self-defense, not because they advocated violence. That's a very different proposition. That they had free breakfast programs for school children, and they had health clinics in cities around the country, that they had food programs for all kinds of people, that they offered support for tenants' rights, for workers' rights, for community organizing in a whole bunch of different ways, because their vision was to take care of the community. Their vision was to help people empower themselves, right? They founded schools to teach about Black history in a time when Black history was not being taught, right? And so most people whose immediate reaction is, no, this is bad, we can't talk about this, just genuinely don't know the history. And many people are open-minded enough to be educated about the history. Some people are not, and then that's a whole different thing. But my experience has been that people are more curious than resistant, most people. And so finding ways, like through this book, to kind of say, okay, look, here's something you didn't know. Let's talk about it. Let's think about it, right? There's nothing I can write or say that would take away the controversy that surrounds the Black Panther Party. But I don't think that because something's controversial, we shouldn't talk about it. I don't think that because it's controversial, it shouldn't be explored and discussed and tried to be understood. You know, I'm not someone who can imagine, you know, even in the 1960s, imagine like picking up a gun, right? Like that's not who I am. That's not my personality. But when you look at the historical context that led the Panthers to make that choice, it's very understandable why a group of Black people in that place and in that time would decide that self-defense and arming themselves was the best choice, was the path, right? And so that to me is what's interesting about it, is like understanding why it happened, understanding what it was, right? And how can we, especially as young people, take what we learn from this book, from this story, from this history, and carve new paths for the same kind of freedom, the same kind of empowerment, the same kind of education, and so forth, that the Panthers were advocating for. Their goals were the same as the traditional civil rights movement that we celebrate. They wanted peace, equality, freedom, justice, housing, right? Basic needs to be met for people across racial identities and across backgrounds, and they wanted it to happen peacefully. But it wasn't the Panthers who were saying this can't happen peacefully. It was the powers that be, and it still is.
Well, thank you. And I think that is a good place to end. And we'll also have to end there because we've come to time. I see there are more questions, including one about how you came to this. And I think actually your recorded interview talks a bit about that. So I encourage Yulia to go and take a look at the video on demand that Kekla recorded earlier to talk about her process. And so thank you so much, Kekla, for being here. It was really wonderful to talk with you. I'm really excited about this book. And thank you to our audience for listening and for participating. Again, we've been talking with Kekla Magoon about her new book, Revolution in Our Time, the Black Panther Party's Promise to the People. And thank you again for joining, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thank you. Thank you so much.